Alchemy has always sparked curiosity, whether as the precursor to chemistry or as a system of hidden knowledge. For centuries, it was studied by both scientists and mystics, each seeking something different. Some pursued gold, while others sought inner transformation. This fascination never faded, and today, alchemy continues to influence fields like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. In recent years, researchers have returned to studying alchemy with a fresh perspective. Historians analyze its cultural significance, while psychologists, such as Carl Jung, interpret it as a symbolic path to self-knowledge. Outside the academic world, alchemy has become part of modern spirituality, with many people looking to it for answers to existential questions and personal development practices. But do we truly understand alchemy as it really was? Is there something essential that has been distorted or lost over time? If it were merely an ancient science, its impact would have faded long ago. What keeps alchemy alive today might be something far greater than we imagine. From its very beginnings, alchemy oscillated between science and mysticism, shifting between the laboratory and the temple. For centuries, it was seen as the art of turning base metals into gold, a discipline shrouded in secrecy and enigmatic metaphors. But this interpretation changed dramatically when scholars like Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung began to see it as a process of inner transformation. To Jung, the alchemist wasn't just manipulating external substances. He was working on his own psyche, striving for individuation, the alignment between the conscious and the unconscious. This view radically altered how alchemy was understood, suggesting that alchemical texts were, in fact, a map for the human soul's spiritual evolution. However, this approach was not universally accepted without scrutiny. The modern historiography of alchemy, influenced by researchers such as Lawrence Principe and William Newman, challenged the psychological and symbolic interpretation. To them, medieval alchemists were more focused on laboratory practice than on philosophical reflections about the soul. They argue that when we translate ancient texts through a modern lens, we risk projecting meanings onto them that were never truly there. As a result, alchemy, which once seemed to belong primarily to the esoteric realm, has increasingly been reinterpreted as an early scientific theory of nature. This new perspective has paved the way for a more technical understanding, but it has also shaken many long-held beliefs. This leads to an intriguing question. Is spiritual alchemy, as we understand it today, a modern invention? Or did the alchemists themselves already see it as a path to something beyond the mere manipulation of metals? This doubt becomes even more relevant when we examine alchemical symbols and metaphors found throughout ancient manuscripts. Some images clearly evoke internal transformation processes, while others appear to describe only chemical procedures. This brings us into a territory where the line between material practice and spiritual quest becomes blurred. And perhaps the key to understanding this mystery lies in the very evolution of alchemy over time. For centuries, alchemy was seen as an experimental science, an attempt to understand and manipulate matter. The medieval alchemists spent days in front of the furnace, mixing substances in hopes of discovering the legendary philosopher's stone. But was he only interested in transmuting metals? Many scholars argue that the spiritualization of alchemy is a modern interpretation, influenced by our contemporary search for meaning. If we go back in time, we see that early treatises spoke of sulfur, mercury, and salt in a purely objective way, as physical ingredients for chemical processes, without any mention of an inner awakening. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was alchemy always intended to have a spiritual purpose, or was this idea added later? But there is something curious. Many alchemical texts are written in an enigmatic style, filled with allegories, metaphors, and symbols that seem to conceal a deeper meaning. dragons devouring their own tails, kings dissolving in sulfur baths, birds ascending in flames. These are not mere records of chemical experiments. Something more profound is embedded within these images. Perhaps the alchemists were indeed working with metals and substances, but they were also concealing knowledge that only the initiated could comprehend. What emerges here is a crossroads between a strictly technical view and one that sees alchemy as a process of soul elevation. And what if the truth lies somewhere in between? What if alchemy, from the very beginning, was a dual science, dealing with both the transformation of lead into gold and the inner transformation of the alchemist himself? The idea that matter reflects spirit may seem modern, but traces of it can be found in ancient texts. The question that arises now is, where exactly did this transition begin? Did early European alchemists already perceive this spiritual dimension, or was it introduced later by other traditions? To understand this, we must look at the origins of alchemy in the West. Alchemy arrived in Europe in the 12th century, brought by translators who saw in Arabic texts a promising science. At first, there was no transcendental mystery. The earliest European alchemists were focused on laboratory experiments, trying to understand the composition of metals and develop methods for their transmutation. They did not speak of spiritual enlightenment or self-knowledge. Their concerns were practical, related to metallurgy and the search for elixirs with medicinal properties. Esoteric references were virtually non-existent. So the question remains, if European alchemy began this way, where did the idea of inner transformation come from? Over time, something began to change. Islamic texts contained sophisticated knowledge about the nature of substances and the processes of distillation and purification. Some of these treatises, such as those attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan, already included certain analogies that could be interpreted symbolically. Despite this, the first generation of European alchemists, like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, did not seem particularly interested in these hidden layers. To them, alchemy was still a branch of experimental chemistry, a tool for understanding the elements. But then, subtly, more philosophical readings of alchemical texts began to emerge, as if some scholars saw in them something beyond what was written. What could have triggered this shift? Did alchemists themselves begin to realize that the purification of metals had parallels with the transformation of the soul? Or was it contact with older traditions that started to shape this perspective? This question leads us directly to a crucial point: the influence of Islamic and Greek alchemy on European thought, something that might give us clues about how alchemy evolved from a mere science into a path of enlightenment. European alchemy did not emerge in a vacuum. Its roots are deeply intertwined with the knowledge of the Islamic world and the Greek tradition. One of the great markers of this connection is Zosimos of Panopolis, an alchemist from Greco-Roman Egypt who saw alchemy as a process of purification, both of matter and of the soul. In his writings, there are references to dreams, visions, and metaphors that indicate something beyond the mere manipulation of substances. This perspective, infused with Neoplatonic and Hermetic influences, survived through the centuries and found a new home in the Islamic world, where it was absorbed and reinterpreted by Arab scholars. However, when Christian translators in the 12th century began bringing Arabic texts into Latin, something curious happened. They were far more interested in the technical aspects of alchemy than in its philosophy. They saw in the Islamic tradition a useful body of knowledge for laboratory practice but ignored, or perhaps did not understand, the spiritual dimension that some of these texts carried. Meanwhile, within the Islamic world, alchemists like Al-Razi and Avicenna were already questioning certain esoteric ideas, trying to separate science from mysticism. In this way, the West received a filtered version of alchemical knowledge, focused on chemistry, without the full symbolic depth that could have been inherited from Greek thought. This leads us to an intriguing point. If spiritual alchemy was not transmitted directly from the Arabs to the Europeans, how did it emerge in the West? The answer may lie in the way Europeans themselves reinterpreted alchemy in the face of their cultural and religious changes. If Islamic thought prioritized science, what led Europeans to see in the alchemical process something beyond matter? The answer might be found in the gradual separation between technical and spiritual alchemy, a phenomenon that would become increasingly evident in the following centuries. In the early centuries of its practice in Europe, alchemy was essentially a technical discipline. Alchemists like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus were interested in processes of distillation, calcination, and the transmutation of metals. The treatises of the time described detailed experiments, instructing on the creation of elixirs, metal alloys, and even medicines. There was, of course, a certain mystery surrounding these processes, as alchemists often concealed their secrets in coded language, but this did not necessarily mean they were speaking of spiritual enlightenment. For many, alchemy was an occult science, but only in the sense that its knowledge was reserved for the initiated, not because it involved any form of soul transformation. But something began to change. As the Renaissance approached, scholars started to see alchemical symbols differently. What was once merely a process of purifying lead now seemed to apply to the alchemist himself. Sulfur and mercury, which in earlier treatises were purely chemical substances, began to be viewed as representations of internal forces within the human being. This shift was driven, in part, by the rise of humanist thought and the influence of esoteric currents that began merging with the alchemical tradition. Even so, many medieval texts continued to lack any spiritual connotation, showing that the division between technical and spiritual alchemy was not immediate but rather a gradual process. What led to this new perspective? Did alchemists themselves begin to realize that the physical processes they carried out could serve as metaphors for inner transformation? Or was it the cultural and religious shift of the time that forced this new interpretation? Either way, alchemy came to be seen not just as a path to obtaining gold, but as a means of achieving a different kind of wealth, enlightenment. This shift would become even more evident in the 16th century, when thinkers like Paracelsus and Gerhard Dorn began to reinterpret alchemy through an entirely new lens. In the 16th century, alchemy underwent a transformation that would change its history forever. Until then, most European alchemists had been focused on technical experiments, searching for ways to transmute metals and develop medicinal elixirs. But with the rise of Renaissance thought, a new vision began to emerge. The idea that alchemy was not just a chemical process but also an inner journey. Great figures, such as Paracelsus, started to emphasize that true transmutation did not take place only in the alchemical furnace but within the human being. This was the moment when spiritual alchemy began to solidify as a tradition distinct from laboratory alchemy. One of the most influential figures in this shift was Gerhard Dorn, a disciple of Paracelsus. Dorn argued that the philosopher's stone was not merely a transmuted metal but a symbol of the complete integration of the human being. To him, the alchemist should seek both external and internal transformation, uniting body, mind, and spirit. This idea resonated deeply with the Hermetic ideals of the time, which asserted that everything in the universe was interconnected. Alchemy thus came to be seen as a reflection of existence itself, where each chemical process symbolized a stage of psychological and spiritual development. But what caused this reinterpretation? Had alchemists always held this perspective and only now begun to reveal it, or was it the cultural context that pushed them in this direction? The fact remains that spiritual alchemy began gaining strength precisely when European society was undergoing significant religious and philosophical transformations. This new approach differed from traditional medieval alchemy and paved the way for a generation of alchemists who, in the following centuries, would further develop this tradition. To better understand this transition, we need to examine the symbols used by medieval alchemists. During the Middle Ages, alchemy was a field shrouded in mystery, but not always for the reasons many assume. Alchemical texts were filled with metaphors and enigmatic symbols, but in most cases, this did not mean they were speaking of spiritual enlightenment. Many of these symbols were simply coded ways of describing chemical processes. A king dissolving in acid was not necessarily an archetype of soul transformation, but rather a way of illustrating the effect of nitric acid on noble metals. This cryptic language was necessary because alchemical knowledge was valuable and, at times, dangerous in the wrong hands. Moreover, the Church did not look favorably upon certain practices that could be interpreted as deviations from the faith. However, this does not mean that medieval alchemy was entirely devoid of mysticism. Many alchemists believed that their processes were aligned with cosmic forces, and the search for the Philosopher's Stone was seen as an attempt to imitate nature's perfection. Yet, one must be cautious not to impose modern interpretations onto ancient texts. What appears to us as a spiritual allegory may have been, for medieval alchemists, merely a literary device or a code to conceal their knowledge from unwanted scrutiny. Some scholars argue that there was indeed an esoteric subtext in certain treatises, but it is difficult to determine to what extent this was intentional or merely a later reading. Additionally, the reputation of alchemists in medieval society was ambiguous. To some, they were brilliant scientists, precursors of modern chemistry. To others, they were charlatans promising to transform lead into gold and make kings wealthy with miraculous formulas. This duality helped fuel the aura of mystery surrounding alchemy and contributed to its marginalization in the following centuries. As science began to establish itself as a distinct field, separate from philosophy and religion, alchemy lost ground and came to be rejected by the emerging thinkers of the modern era. But this rejection did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that accompanied the rise of chemistry and the rationality of the Enlightenment. With the advancement of science in the 17th century, alchemy began to lose its place in academic circles. What was once regarded as a serious practice of experimentation was gradually discredited as modern chemistry emerged as an independent discipline. The experiments of Robert Boyle, for example, demonstrated that alchemical principles were not sustainable within a rigorously scientific method. The pursuit of metal transmutation came to be seen as an illusion, a philosophical error from an era when science was still in its infancy. Over time, alchemists were marginalized, and alchemy began to be labeled as a pseudoscience. But what is curious is that this rejection did not lead to the disappearance of alchemy. Many alchemists who saw their work discredited shifted into other fields, such as metallurgy and the chemical industry. The centuries-old experience they had accumulated in distillation, extraction, and purification processes was ultimately absorbed into emerging chemical knowledge. At the same time, certain esoteric circles began to reinterpret alchemy, shifting its focus from physical transmutation to a more abstract and philosophical transformation. Thus, spiritual alchemy began to take on a new meaning, detached from laboratory practices and more aligned with the occult traditions that would develop in the following centuries. The paradox of alchemy in the modern age is that, by being rejected by science, it found a new territory in which to flourish, the world of esotericism. Science may have dismissed its methods, but its symbolism remained alive, influencing various mystical movements, such as the Rosicrucians and Theosophy. But there was an even more decisive factor in this transition: the Protestant Reformation, which shook the foundations of European spirituality and created the perfect environment for the reinterpretation of alchemy. And it is precisely this impact that we will explore next. The Protestant Reformation brought an unprecedented rupture in European spirituality. By challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and emphasizing the direct relationship between the individual and God, the movement paved the way for new forms of religious and philosophical thought. This new landscape provided fertile ground for the growth of spiritual alchemy. The idea of Christus in nobis, Christ within us, resonated deeply with alchemical concepts of inner transformation. If salvation no longer depended exclusively on the Church, but rather on an individual process of purification, spiritual alchemy began to fit perfectly within this new paradigm. Many Protestant thinkers started to reinterpret alchemy through this perspective. The purification of metals was associated with the purification of the soul, and the philosopher's stone came to be seen as a symbol of spiritual enlightenment. This shift in perspective led alchemy to evolve from a quest for a physical elixir into, for some, a path to spiritual ascension. Meanwhile, in more traditional circles, alchemy was still practiced in laboratories, but a clear division had emerged between those who viewed it as a means of personal evolution and those who still sought tangible results in matter. The impact of this transformation was profound. Alchemists began to express their ideas differently, using a language that blended Christianity, Hermeticism, and esoteric symbolism. Figures such as Jacob Boehme helped popularize this new approach, integrating mystical elements into alchemical practice. This fusion of spirituality and alchemy would become even more evident with Paracelsus, who took this vision to another level. But who exactly was this revolutionary alchemist, and why did his ideas mark a definitive turning point in the history of spiritual alchemy? If there was one alchemist who broke the mold and redefined the practice, it was Paracelsus. At a time when alchemy was seen primarily as a technical method for transmuting metals, he dared to claim that true transformation occurred within the alchemist himself. For Paracelsus, matter and spirit were deeply connected, and alchemy was not confined to the laboratory. It was a tool for healing both body and soul. His concept of spiritus described a divine principle present within human beings, which could be awakened through alchemy. This was a pivotal moment in the history of spiritual alchemy, as it introduced the idea that chemical processes were mere reflections of inner transformations. The impact of this perspective was revolutionary. While other alchemists were focused solely on obtaining the philosopher's stone, Paracelsus argued that the true alchemical goal was wisdom and healing. He believed that all diseases had a spiritual cause and that true medicine should not only treat physical symptoms but also correct the energetic imbalances of the individual. This approach would influence future generations and help establish alchemy as a path to self-knowledge, going beyond the mere manipulation of substances. Paracelsus saw no distinction between science and spirituality. To him, they were simply two sides of the same coin. But what is most fascinating is how his ideas influenced the alchemists who followed. If alchemy had once been purely a laboratory process, it was now beginning to evolve into a path of inner illumination. And it didn't stop there. In the 17th century, this vision grew even stronger, and spiritual alchemy was embraced by esoteric societies seeking to understand the hidden mysteries of the universe. If Paracelsus was the great pioneer of this transformation, the centuries that followed would take spiritual alchemy to even greater depths. In the 17th century, spiritual alchemy was no longer just a marginal idea. It began to establish itself within esoteric and philosophical circles. With the decline of technical alchemy and the rise of modern chemistry, those who still saw value in the alchemical tradition started to reinterpret it as a path of self-transformation. Texts such as Azoth and Fire began drawing parallels between the philosopher's stone and Christ himself, suggesting that the true purpose of alchemy was redemption and the purification of the human soul. This new approach blended Christian elements with Hermetic concepts, creating a powerful synthesis that would influence future generations of mystics and occultists. The rise of spiritual alchemy was also driven by the growth of esoteric societies. The Rosicrucians, for example, embraced many alchemical ideas and transformed them into a philosophical system that promised the awakening of consciousness. To them, the processes described in ancient alchemical treatises did not refer solely to the transformation of metals, but to the transmutation of the soul itself. This period saw the emergence of numerous manuscripts attempting to decipher the secrets of alchemy through a symbolic lens, often reinterpreting ancient texts with a spiritual perspective that may not have been present in their original versions. This new vision of alchemy not only ensured its survival, but also paved the way for its impact on later esoteric movements. What was once a practice confined to a select group of alchemists became a field of study for mystics, philosophers, and even certain Christian currents. This expansion elevated spiritual alchemy to an even stronger status in the 18th century when it began merging with Western occultism, forming a tradition that still resonates today. But how exactly did spiritual alchemy establish itself as an independent esoteric tradition? That leads us to the next chapter of this story. As spiritual alchemy solidified in the 17th century, it began to stand out as an esoteric tradition distinct from laboratory alchemy. What had once been a secondary aspect now became the primary focus for many scholars and practitioners. Jacob Boehme, one of the key figures in this movement, deepened the connection between alchemy and Christian mysticism, interpreting alchemical processes as metaphors for the spiritual transformation of the human being. In his writings, he described alchemy as a process of reconciliation between spirit and matter, where the individual must purify their soul in the same way that metals were purified in the alchemical furnace. The impact of this perspective was profound. Movements like the Rosicrucians and, later, Theosophy incorporated spiritual alchemy into their teachings, viewing it as a path to enlightenment and the understanding of the universe's mysteries. The idea that true transmutation occurred in consciousness rather than in metals became central to these groups, and alchemical symbols were no longer studied as descriptions of chemical processes but as keys to spiritual evolution. This period marked the definitive transition of alchemy from a laboratory practice to a widely embraced esoteric philosophy. What is most fascinating is how this transformation has echoed into modern times. The concept of spiritual alchemy is still studied by occultists, psychologists, and contemporary philosophers, and its influence can be seen in various mystical traditions today. The question remains: is this new interpretation of alchemy faithful to what the ancient alchemists truly intended to convey? Or has the original meaning of alchemy been reshaped over the centuries to fit the spiritual needs of modernity? Perhaps the answer lies in a deeper analysis of alchemical texts and the influences that shaped their evolution. Spiritual alchemy has influenced numerous esoteric traditions, shaping movements like the Rosicrucians and Theosophy. Its impact even reached modern psychology, particularly through Carl Jung, who saw it as a reflection of the individuation process. Today, its symbols are still studied as tools for understanding the mind and pursuing inner transformation. If you want to gain a deeper understanding of yourself and unlock your hidden potential, I invite you to explore my ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes: Exploring Inner Transformation Through Jungian Psychology. Inside, you'll find practical exercises that reveal the secrets of Jungian psychology and how to integrate them into your life. And if this content resonated with you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Stay with me for the next video.